This is the future.
Hello, I'm Edwin Rydberg, and you're listening to the Alternate Futures Podcast, where we chat with indie science fiction creators about their work, the world, and anything else in between. Today, I'm here with Christopher Coates. Christopher grew up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and moved to Michigan in the late 1980s to attend Davenport University's paramedic school. He now lives in Kent, Michigan. A retired firefighter and paramedic, he currently works full-time in information systems for a major West Michigan company. In his off time, he enjoys family time, traveling to unique places, and his two dogs who keep life fun. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining me from the other side of the Atlantic.
Thanks, Edwin. Glad to be on with you.
So first thing I did when reading your bio was to look up Kent City, to be honest. From our overlord Google's maps, it looks to be a little bit smaller than what we usually consider to be a city. Is that correct?
I know people that live 50 miles from me that have never heard of it.
Right. Okay.
So it is not some place that you would be familiar with. I think we have about little under 3,000 people in the whole community.
Now, so you're challenging where I grew up then, yes.
So
Yeah, it reminded me of Dawson City, made famous in the first X-Men movie when Hope gets dropped off. Yeah, and when the one street town. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a, we do have 2 traffic lights, so we're pretty big time.
That is big time. My hometown doesn't have a traffic light yet, so you're doing better than us. And the second thing I noticed was you were a firefighter paramedic in your earlier days.
Yeah.
Most of your career. Could you tell me a bit about that? It must have been quite an interesting career.
I decided that was the direction I wanted to take out of high school, and I got on with the local fire department, and they sent me to EMT school, which I really loved, and I had been looking for a direction, what I really wanted to do, and so I decided I wanted to go on and get a degree in emergency medical services, get my paramedic license. And so I moved from Massachusetts to Michigan, which was when they had a great paramedic program at the time. And so I went to school there and started working as a paramedic and did that full time for 10 years. And then after that, I'd gotten married and my daughter was born, and I had missed her first 2 birthdays and Christmas because I had to work, and I decided that I needed to do something different. So I changed to information systems, but continued to do fire and EMS part-time on the side until 2016, when I eventually stopped because of a back injury. And so now I still do information systems, but 30 years of fire and EMS is over.
Yeah, it's amazing what having a child can do to your outlook as well, isn't it?
Oh yeah, priorities certainly change.
Yeah. Do you have any really interesting stories about your paramedic or firefighting days?
See, that's where I made a mistake, and that's what I have told a number of people that are going into that profession, is that from day one, start a journal, because it won't be long and you'll have forgotten so many amazing stories. There are all kinds of crazy things from one end of the spectrum to the other, from amazing and wonderful to gruesome and depressing. I was working primarily inside the city of Grand Rapids, which our area had about 1 million people. So it was an area where we were busy. We were running a lot of calls. At the same time, I was also running with our local rural fire department where I live, which was very quiet. So I had both ends of the spectrum. I liked working in the Grand Rapids area because it's surrounded by farmland. And so I could run an inner city shooting 1 minute and a farm accident the next. So it gave you a wide variety of experiences. And it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it must have kept you busy, I imagine.
Absolutely.
A lot of the stuff you write is apocalyptic. Do you think that influenced you in any way?
To some degree. There's definitely technology from my current information systems work and medical in every book to some degree. I don't aim, none of them are based on that. At the same time, they always find their way in. And so those are areas that I'm very familiar with.
Did you have trouble switching to IT? It's such a sedentary position versus the go of the paramedic firefighter world.
A little bit. When I first made that change to IT, it was right about the whole time of the whole Y2K thing, when everybody was all worried about technology, everybody was refreshing their technology. So it had been around 1999 when IT was really just starting. And so there were a number of us who worked in EMS, who made that change to IT. People I worked with, there were probably about 4 or 5 of us who made that change about the same time. And the biggest challenge I found was that as a paramedic, when I leave at the end of the day, everything's done. And then when I come in the next day, it's starting fresh. Well, in IT, it was a very different mindset, and it would be for a lot of places, but it wasn't something I dealt with, where when I went home, I was still thinking about what I had to work on the next day. And, I just wasn't used to that. And I found for a little while that's kept me up at night, just because I was thinking about the stuff that I'd be doing the next day, which I hadn't had to do before. And so it was an interesting challenge. The other bigger challenge was when people would be all concerned about an IT related problem. And it's like, wait, nobody's dying here. Why are we worried about this? But to them, it was a crisis. And so it was kind of fun trying to navigate that without making their concerns seem unimportant. But at the same time, I was able to keep a perspective about what really mattered. We'll take care of this, but this isn't something to panic about.
It must have been quite interesting coming from the literal life and death world into the pseudo life and death IT world.
This is a funny story. When I first left full-time EMS, I was still doing fire EMS part-time on the side. And I was working in my first IT job. And I got called by a receptionist, and there was a bunch of people standing around. And they had said, there's a detective from the sheriff's department on the phone. And I said, okay. And they're all worked up. Obviously, they've been talking. They said, they want to talk to you about a homicide. And I was like, okay. And that to them, that was absolutely from another planet. And I was like, they need a statement about something I saw. And so that was it was a funny experience because of the reaction people had to that line of work and what I found to be commonplace things I dealt with.
Well, that makes me think of when you were saying you were staying up at night for the IT work, but you were able to sort of shut off for the paramedic work. And I think most people would have felt it would be the opposite way around. Some of the stuff you might have seen as a paramedic would keep you up at night, whereas you wouldn't imagine the IT would usually keep you up.
No, it was more of a, because it was carrying over into the next day, I had this, it was still on my mind about, the situation. But as a paramedic, when you left, it was over. When you dropped them off, it was done.
So you actually mentioned in your indie book showcase, Author Insights, that you've had to adapt also to the sitting situation. This is an issue I have with a lot of computer work. I imagine when you're a paramedic, you were on the go all the time, and you switched to IT, and there's a lot of sedentary lifestyle. How do you manage to deal with that? Has it had much impact on you, or?
Yeah, you gain a lot of weight. Even if you're sitting in an ambulance for hours on end, there's plenty of times when you're up and you're moving, you're active. And so this was just a change on the body, and so you just have to try to find ways to, just like everybody else who doesn't have an active job, where to get some exercise where you can, but it was definitely a change of pace.
So move on to your books now, because you have 4 books out: Ark, Anvil, Alternate Purpose, and The Resurrection Wager. So you published the Ark. How long ago was it? Like 10 years ago, was it?
The Ark was about 10 years ago. It was the first anything I ever wrote. So I had not done any writing. And so the very first thing I did was a novel, which was kind of daunting at the time, but it was a ton of fun and I absolutely loved it. And I enjoyed it. And when it was done, I considered it the story complete. And so I wasn't going to do, as far as I'm sure, the story was over. And I got an awful lot of feedback from people wanting more, wanting a sequel. And so actually the 4th book I wrote, the one that just came out, is The Anvil, which is a sequel to the Ark. And so that I call it a parallel story because, they kind of come at the same thing from a couple different angles, even though there's a merger of characters and it's the same timeline, the same events. And then at the end, they kind of meet up and then kind of move forward. And so I had never seen how I was going to do a second book, but with all that feedback, I kind of started thinking about it. And one day I was like, all right, I think I know how I can do this. And it came out very well. So I'm pretty pleased with it. And I did manage to leave a spot so that I could take it one step further with a 3rd book. I don't know if I'm going to. That's something I'm going to have to think about for right now. Right now, I'm started a new project, which I'm working on. So we'll finish that first.
So what inspired you then to start writing?
I had always wanted to, and my father was a writer. Uh, he wrote advertising copy and so forth, and he had written a book that he had never gotten published, but this was long before computers. When as soon as the computers and word processing came out, writing became easy. Everybody could do it. He was back in the days when the old manual typewriter is how he wrote a book, and if you made a mistake, you started over on that page.
Yeah, those were really nasty, I remember.
I would never have written like that. Never would have. And so I knew that it was a big deal to him, and it kind of made it interesting to me. And I had a number of ideas in my head for years. And one day I thought, well, let's just see where this goes. And 2.5 years later, the book was done. And I went to try to get it published, and I couldn't get anybody to even look at it. A number of people replied back, and they said that, we're only looking at people that have been published before. I'm like, okay, then how does somebody who hasn't been published get looked at? I'd have been satisfied if somebody had looked at my book, or maybe a couple of people had looked at it and said, this is junk. I'd have been fine. I can't write. I'll move on and not worry about it. But I couldn't even get anybody to look at it and say they didn't like it. And so it was very frustrating. And by then I was about 2/3 of the way through writing The Resurrection Wager. And I got frustrated, and I kind of put it on the shelf for about 8 years, left The Resurrection Wager unfinished and the Ark unpublished. And a friend of mine talked to me about self-publishing it. To me, that sounded like a lot of trouble, and it wasn't what I was looking for originally. But they said, check it out. I've heard good things. And so I started looking at it. And within a week, it was available on Amazon. I was like, well, that was easy. And then I went and I said, hey, everybody, my book's available. And I hadn't looked at it in a long time. And so I went back. So this would have been about 2016, 2017. And I read through it again. And there was a spot in the book that referred to the near future as being the year 2010. I'm like, wait a second, it's 2016 and I just published this. And so I quickly updated the book because it had been sitting so long. I got some things out of line and put it back out there. And then I proceeded to work on The Resurrection Wager and get that out there. And so that's where it all started. And after that, I was picked up by a publishing company. And so now everything that I've done has gone through them. And so I haven't, but both of those books were initially self-published.
It's so amazing now, isn't it? Sort of the last 10 years, the whole self-publishing industry has really exploded, and
it's great.
It's so much easier to publish now than even
it is.
10, 15 years ago.
Gives people an opportunity to get their work out there that never could have before.
So with the Ark, what made you decide to write a apocalyptic story, and why that particular apocalypse?
I can't really say, because it's been so long. But the idea of that had been in my mind for a long time. And so I had just, with one of my later books, I kind of can say where the ideas came from. But with the Ark, it's something that I think had just been churning around in my mind for a long time. And at this point, I'm not really sure where the idea came from. I'm not one of those people that plots out their stories, ahead of time. So pretty much all by the seat of your pants. I came up on a spot in a book recently that I'm writing, and I knew it was the funeral scene. And so I sat down and started typing, knowing that this would be the funeral scene, but nothing else. And as I typed, it developed. And by the time I was done, I was like, oh, didn't expect it to go there. Well, that's neat. And that's why I enjoy writing, is watching the story develop. It's almost like it comes alive, and it develops itself as I type it. That's the fun of it for me. If I had to actually sit there and plot it out chapter by chapter ahead of time, that would take all the fun out of writing for me.
Yeah, a lot of authors I've spoken to say the same thing. It's sort of the wonder of the journey.
Yes, it's exciting to know where it's going to go. The book I'm writing right now, I have a pretty good idea where it's going to go. I didn't when I started writing it, but now I'm pretty sure where it's going to go. But at the same time, I also know that's not certain until I'm done, because things could change.
So do you think it's a spoiler to tell what the apocalypse is for the Ark? I can't remember whether it's, it's pretty obvious on the cover.
It is. I don't consider it a spoiler. That would take, there are lots of things we wouldn't want to talk about. But the idea is that there is a comet with strange deadly properties that is going to be making a near pass on Earth. And it is going to result in the loss of all but, over 99% of the people on the planet. And the Ark is about discovering that this risk and the need to maintain secrecy so that you don't have panic, at the same time putting together plans on how you're going to do this and make sure that the human race can survive and rebuild. And then, of course, the anvil takes, and it focuses one of the directions, one of the plans on how we're going to get through this. But there are other things that are going on at the same time, other efforts. And the anvil takes a different one of those paths. And so that's where I call it a parallel story, because they're dealing with the same basic issue, but from two different directions.
Does the anvil feature some of the characters then from, say, the end of the Ark?
Yes, there is a clear spot where you actually, somebody who has read the Ark will be like, oh, I know this chapter. It's being described from a different person's perspective, but it's still the same scene. And so there's several scenes like that. And so, yeah, if somebody is familiar with one, they will certainly know at the point where they come together.
And I was wondering now, so I don't know if it's just me, but I have a lot of articles in my news feeds that show up as, asteroids coming close to the Earth and stuff. And it seems there's a lot more talk about that kind of thing as we've entered this new decade. And you're not feeling prophetic about this or anything.
No, I remember back when I was a kid, there were a number of times when asteroids were called out. So this would have been in the 80s, that this was be making a close pass, and should we be worried about this thing that's coming 60 years from now? As a society, as a human race, we always need to have something to panic over. And so we're always seeing things like this and being concerned about them, and they tend to not be a big deal. And that's something called out in the Ark. They don't want to make a big deal of it. They don't want to raise any alarms too quickly, because they know that, in the past, they've all kind of fizzled out to be no big problem. And so, they take a lot of time to make sure that, this really is as bad as they think it's going to be before they let, the word out.
Right. In the Ark, I was actually quite surprised at how positive you are, I think, about human nature, especially maybe coming from your background and all the things you may have seen in your life. But most of the people, with very few exceptions, were actually very reasonable people. And that's surprisingly even the military generals, which, Hollywood likes to always dump on. Is that just a sort of a general positive outlook you have on humanity, or is just everyone coming together?
At the time I wrote that book, I probably would have said, yeah, I kind of hope that's how it would be. As I've gotten older and I've seen more, I realize that I have a feeling of being much more of a bloodthirsty free-for-all to how am I going to save myself, rather than focus on saving, mankind in general. And so, yeah, I've had a number of people have commented that, I seem to have a positive reaction about how people would respond. And that's certainly how I would hope things would go. But I think there's a little bit darker side to humanity than I may have let on.
Do you think you might make another parallel story that features a part of society that does completely degenerate?
There are an awful lot of books out there that have to do with the end of the world, whether it's from an electromagnetic pulse or a nuclear war. And they are basically everybody shooting at each other and constant scenes of violence. And I didn't want this book to be like that. And while, as there are, things that do happen that have to be dealt with, I didn't want this to be one of those things where you end up with clan versus clan shooting each other. And I didn't want that type of story. And so, yeah, there's plenty of action. There's plenty of stuff going on, but I wanted to keep that to a minimum.
There was one thing I noticed in the Ark, then the US doesn't share the information with any other countries. And I found that interesting. Is that sort of something you think would happen, or is it just, I was just wondering if you'd comment on that.
The whole reason nothing gets shared is because of the need to prevent panic and chaos. there's an awful lot that needs to happen to prepare, and to do that, you need to maintain, some degree of order. And in order to do that, you had to maintain secrecy. Now, at the end of the anvil, it talks about rebuilding, and it talks about how the people that are trying to do the rebuilding that are in the US are very unsuccessful when trying to deal with other nations who along the way found out that this information had been kept from them. And so in reality, if this were to happen, I doubt there would be that level of secrecy could be maintained, because there wouldn't be that type of discipline in the few people that did know about it. And it certainly wouldn't be internationally kept. But
Yeah.
the whole reason I did that was the idea that secrecy needed to be maintained to prevent chaos.
So moving on to some of your other books, then, the Resurrection Wager and Alternate Purpose. That's the one that features a pandemic, doesn't it?
Well, a pandemic, it's not the point of the story. It's not the plot of the story, but it is mentioned in there. And the arrival of that story to market was really bad timing, because I released that to my publisher in the fall of 2019, before anybody heard of COVID. And it was published in January of 2020, as all of that was coming about. And I'm not sure people wanted to read about a pandemic, even though that's not the focus. It's a component of the book. And so, yeah, so we have that in there, and it was written from a mindset about pandemics before we actually, got to experience one.
Right. Yeah. And so the technology and whatnot for the last two books seems to feature time travel.
Both the Resurrection Wager and Alternate Purpose, a big, part of it is about time travel. I think time travel is a lot of fun. I think it's, the whole idea of it, and the nuances of time travel, and the things you have to be careful of, so that the story actually makes sense while incorporating it. I find it enjoyable to write. And so I enjoyed that part of the Resurrection Wager. So when I did Alternate Purpose, I thought, that would be fun to include some time travel in there and to make that a different story. The Alternate Purpose really is about, it's, a pandemic comes and wipes out society, but they realize that the only way to resolve things or fix things is to keep it from ever having happened. And so they have people who had been working on time travel technology, and now it becomes a priority. How do we send somebody back in time to keep this from ever having happened, to prevent this? And so that's really what the story is about. It's more about the mission to, change, so that this does not happen, than it is about the pandemic itself.
So with that structure, I guess you didn't really worry about the kind of causality violations, or were they concerns and you had to build all of that into your story?
Since we were going back in time for the specific purpose of wiping out what happens going forward, I wasn't as concerned about in Resurrection Wager, there are things that come up where we did something really minor in the past, and we see how that could have huge consequences going forward. And that's why I enjoy time travel stories, because you can really build on things like that. But in Alternate Purpose, that didn't really matter, because the whole idea was to change everything going forward back to what it should have been.
What about the idea that if they wiped themselves out by accident, that they wouldn't be able to go back?
They didn't go back that far. And so, that wasn't a concern. They weren't going back to before the people who invented time travel were born.
And so Resurrection Wager, you label as Christian science fiction because of the wager. Mm-hmm. Were you at all concerned about approaching this issue?
Not at all. As a Christian, I have no problem proclaiming what I think. I don't bring religion, for the most part, into my other books, so that if somebody did have different beliefs, they wouldn't be concerned about it. And so Resurrection Wager was my attempt to actually write Christian fiction. And I shouldn't say attempt, that's what it is. And I found it interesting and very different to write. And so I wasn't at all concerned that somebody would be bothered by it. hope that they would know what it was going into it. And it is a fun time travel story. I've had a number of comments in the reviews saying that while they may not be a believer, they were able to enjoy the science fiction story and the time travel story because it's not really pushing anything, at the reader, aggressively.
I remember reading The Light of Other Days by Arthur C. Clarke, and it wasn't a time travel story, but it was a technological development story where they created remote seeing through joined wormholes.
Okay.
And so finally in the end he makes a very subtle comment about them, looking back on history around the time of Jesus, because obviously if that was possible, people would do it. But he doesn't make any comments at all about what they saw or any conclusions. So he kind of sidesteps the whole issue.
There are times when you need to, stay away from certain things because you don't want to exclude a part of your audience. And so that's why I make sure, to declare that book as a Christian fiction story.
So on this topic of time travel still, and alternate futures, is there anything you would go back and change if you had the chance?
See, it's real easy to say, yes, I want to change, a lot of things. There's a lot of things I wish had been done differently. But then you think about if you go back and you change something, how the consequences of that. If you change a relationship that happens, not only are you affecting what goes on then, but anything that may have developed from that relationship becomes erased. Right. And so it's such a can of worms, the idea of going back and changing things, that it makes me far less likely to say that I would actually do it. And we talk about that some in the Resurrection Wager, how dangerous it is. And there's an example that I use, when talking about this, and said if I were to go back in time and make a purchase at a grocery store, that seems like a rather irrelevant thing. But that means that I got in line at the grocery store. That means that somebody else that would have gotten in line where I did now got in line somewhere else. That means that they had interactions with other people that they wouldn't necessarily have had, and that they missed out on interactions that they could have had. And if, who knows what that could change? That could change somebody's timing leaving the store to be slightly different. And maybe they were supposed to be killed in an accident. That's how the timeline was. And now because I went back and did this, they're 5 seconds different on their travel, and now they aren't killed. Now that changes who the relationships that they're involved in, and going forward, somebody who would have been a wonderful leader, in the country may never even be born now, simply because I went back and I made a purchase in a grocery store. And so to say, yeah, is there things I'd like to go back and change? Well, there are things I wish were different, but to actually take the responsibility of going back and making a change, that responsibility you're taking for something that could have significant effects.
So I like to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and one of the big things that's happened at the end of their whole 10-year process was a large time travel story. And then we've entered with the Loki on Disney Plus, which features a lot of time-related issues, which clearly are going to be significant moving forward in the whole Avengers series. And what they've done is they've talked about a multiverse
Right.
in regards to their time travel. And is that something you would ever consider if you continued writing time travel books?
From the way I understand it, that almost makes the suggestion, depending on how you look at it, that if I were to go back in time, I really couldn't alter the future, in the way that I, propose it in my books. And so, no, I would stick with the idea strictly that, if you change something in the past, it will affect the future. Without going there. And I have seen the Marvel stories and I've enjoyed them, and my son and I have gone to the movies and I find them fun and I enjoy the time travel part, but I like to keep it on the whole idea a little bit on the cleaner, simpler side, that there are causes and effects to what happens from now into the future.
So the arc was set contemporarily, initially at least.
Yeah.
Is that the same for the other books in the series then? Do they start sort of around the present time?
Yes, they all start at the present time, but the alternate purpose, because of the layers of time travel. There are things that happen in the past and there are things that happen a ways in the future. And so, so we do definitely jump around like that, but the initial baseline is, modern times.
Because it occurred to me then that your books fit very well with an alternate futures type of idea, because they sort of start now and then they all branch into different futures. Is there a reason you set them starting now?
I don't have enough imagination to picture, to really build a world of the future. And I say that, but it doesn't, I'm not sure how accurate that is, because in alternate purpose, there's a significant amount of things that happen in the future. And, people from the present are pulled into the future to change things. And the things that they're shocked about, driverless cars and fleets of delivery drones taking off, together with no people involved. And, walking into a restaurant and your car has automatically communicated your arrival, and so that there's a device waiting for you to lead you to your seat, and your menu shows up on your table, instead of anybody coming to you. It's all digitally displayed. And so I do have some fun with picturing the future, but at the same time, for the place where I'm going to start and launch from, for the most part, I have always chose to stay current to the environment that I'm familiar in. But I'm willing to take the time travel piece and use it to go somewhere different.
So is there then any alternate future that you would personally like to see in this world then?
I think we'd all like to see a lot of things change, a lot of things different, a lot of things just cleaner about how people interact and how technology is used. If we could get away from putting our efforts into a lot of junk, we could really make things better for society and for people as a whole. And so, yeah, I would love to see technology used, in a good way instead of selfishly.
And do you think that would ever be a story that you'd be able to actually approach, or is it far too complex to actually try and solve?
I think you could approach it from a story side. I don't think you can approach it actually suggesting that you've got a solution for it, because from what I've seen in my personal perspective, we're heading in the exact opposite direction. And so I don't see us actually getting there, though it would sure be nice.
Okay, so I think that's mostly it for this part. I wanted to move on to the segment I call Revenge of the Muse. So prior to this interview, then I sent you 4 randomly rolled story cubes with the categories of hero, action, setting, and science fiction element. And I asked you to prepare a short introduction to a story using the cubes as a guide. For anyone listening or following along who wants to try this themselves, I'd be posting the images on the alternatefutures.co.uk website in the podcast section. If you wouldn't mind reading what you've written, and then we can sort of discuss your interpretation of the cubes.
Sure. The 4 images were interesting, and I kind of went back and forth a few times on what they meant. And, I had a couple ideas, but then I looked at the order. It seemed like you had them presented. And so this is what I came up with. Wally always had a love of the water, which showed up in all aspects of his life. For 4 years, he was the star of his high school's water polo team. After securing a college scholarship, he continued to impress in the pool while studying marine biology. All that work led him to a career on a research submarine studying the depths of the ocean. It was his dream job, and he loved observing marine life that only lived far below the surface. One January evening, the mini submersible had just been winched aboard the main ship, and Wally opened the door to escape the tiny vessel, not much larger than an old phone booth. As he did, his foot came in contact with the icy deck, and he fell, tumbling over the rail and into the ocean. In horror, the rest of the team watched as he landed in the frigid waters below. Their training kicked in, and they rapidly followed the procedures for rescuing someone in the sea. As fast as they were, when Wally was brought on board, there were no signs of life. His family and friends knew Wally's wishes, and to this day, he remains tied to the earth. His body rests immersed in liquid nitrogen in a cryogenics facility in the desert, awaiting the technology to develop that will allow him to be revived.
So this almost seems like it could be a Captain America type time travel story.
It does very much. Yeah, that wasn't what I was envisioning when I wrote, but now that you say that, it definitely does.
Of all the ones I've rolled so far, you had the ones that were actually most consistent, which is interesting. Did you have a trouble interpreting them at all?
Originally, looking at them, I was going to do a submarine accident, for the hero drowning on the submarine as it fell to the ocean bottom, but I couldn't come up with how to tie the sci-fi piece in. And so I ended up having to shuffle things around and change it to what I came up with. And so it wasn't too hard to put that together. You just had to get something where I could connect all four cubes. I mentally churned it around for a little while before coming up with what I did. But once I finally sat down, I had a pretty good idea of where I was going to go with it.
So I think we've pretty much covered everything today. I wanted to just sort of give you a chance to mention your new work in progress and where people can find you online.
I was challenged by someone who's not big into science fiction to try to write something different that didn't have a sci-fi component. And I'm not a huge sci-fi person. Very little of what I read personally has science fiction in it. Now, I do enjoy science fiction, the Star Trek, the Star Wars, all of that. And I do read a little bit, but most of it's not. And so I thought, okay, let's do something a little different. And so my new project is called The Assassin Awakens. And normally I look for my books to be a minimum of 75,000 words, and this one's already past 45,000. And so it's moving along fairly well. And I've only been at this one since probably March. And so it's moving fairly fast, and it's got an awful lot of, even after I have all the content there, it has a lot of work to do, polishing it up and, getting everything, nice and tight and smooth. But I'm pretty excited about where it's going to go. I'm hoping that it'll be published in less than a year. And so we'll have to see how it goes. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
And so where could people find you online then?
I've got a big following on Twitter at Seacoats Books. Actually, Seacoats Books is what I have connecting me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And I started recently on TikTok, and I've just recently put a couple of brief videos up there. I haven't done much with that. I can't spend too much time, on social media because then I'm not writing. So I'm not doing that, but I also have a web page, which is where I try to direct everybody. And that's Christopher Coates at Weebly.com. And from there, you can link to all my books and the sales and Amazon and the different translations, because 2 of my books are available in Spanish and one's available, actually 2 of them are available in Portuguese as well.
Oh, excellent.
And the Ark and Resurrection Wager are available there, audio through Audible. And so things are really, really growing in that area. And so it's really exciting. And so I try to get people to my website where as a central point.
Yeah, I listened to the Audible version of the Ark and I quite enjoyed it.
Oh, good.
So, Christopher Coates, thank you very much for joining me, and I wish you all the best on your next book.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Transcripts of this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk, as are the Story Cube images and original story openings written by my guests. If you've enjoyed this, why not share it with friends and other sci-fi fans you know? If there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Finally, if you'd like to support this podcast financially, you can do so on Subscribestar. Just search for Alternate Futures. There you can find extra discussions and information that hasn't made it into the final edit. And thank you once again for listening. I hope you'll join us on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.